Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this happy event. We're here to launch a book written by Associate Professor Weihuan Zhou and Professor Henry Gao, entitled Beyond Market Economy and State Capitalism, China's State-Owned Enterprises and the World Trading System. And many people think that the WTO rules need to be amended to deal with the challenge of China's state capitalism. I work primarily in competition law, and similar challenges exist there in that sphere. The authors believe in respect of trade law, however, that the commitments of China in its WTO accession agreement, coupled with existing rules on state capitalism, especially those on subsidies, provide feasible tools to counter any problems which arise from state capitalism. The book provides also concrete suggestions on how the rules may be better utilised to achieve that end. I look forward to hearing from the authors and reading the book, and also listening to the comments from our other distinguished guests. So I will talk to you about everyone's bios at this point so that we can then get straight on to dealing with the discussion. So Henry Gao, who's not online at this stage and I believe is in transit and going through immigration at an airport, but hopefully will be here anytime soon. Henry is a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance, Innovation and Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University. And CIBEL, both myself and Weihuan are directors of the CIBEL Centre. We have a close relationship with Singapore Management University. Henry sits on the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program and the editorial boards of the Journal of International Economic Law and the Journal of Financial Regulation. And my colleague, Associate Professor Weihuan Zhou, is Associate Professor and Director of Research at the Faculty of Law and Justice here, and a co-director with me of CIBEL. He's co-secretary of the Society of International Economic Law, SEAL, and sits on the editorial boards of the World Trade Review and the Journal of International Trade Law and Policy. So those are our authors. Now, our commentators, in order of their presentations, Vivienne is a professor of Chinese and International Business Law at Sydney Law School and Associate Director International of the Centre for Asian and Pacific Law at the University of Sydney. She's also a Senior Research Fellow of the Asia IP and Technology Law Project at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Her teaching and research interests are in international business and economic law, private international law, and Chinese law. James Baxter, on the end here, leads the Office of Global Trade Negotiations at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In that capacity, he oversees Australia's global trade policy development and implementation, including at the WTO, the OECD, and the G20. He has extensive experience in trade agreements and international law, and was Australia's chief negotiator for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP. He has served at Australian missions in Geneva, Brussels, and Tokyo. And finally, last but not least, James Laurenceson is Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology. His academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including the China Economic Review and the China Economic Journal. Professor Laurenceson also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China economic and broader relationship in outlets such as the Financial Review, the Australian, and the South China Morning Post. So those are our faculty for this afternoon. And as I said, I'm looking forward to hearing from the authors and all of our speakers, and I will now hand over to Weihuan.
Thanks, Deb, for the cheering and the introduction. And I also have my speaking notes because I don't want to miss anyone that I need to thank. And Henry and I need to thank for a great assistance in this journey in producing this book. So forgive me if you look at me to reading the notes, but I don't really need the notes to introduce the book, but I need the notes to remember the details about the journey. So first of all, Professor Henry Gao and I have been collaborating for many years, and perhaps about 5 or 6 articles already, which I will come back to talk about, and including this book as well. We have many things to kind of work together in the future. And so, first of all, I as my first thanks, I want to thank my co-author, Henry, to be a very reliable and constructive cooperator during the process, and also thanking my guests today and very, very distinguished panel of speakers. Basically, I think from the broader perspective of how this book should be understood and its implications, not necessarily in the international trade law field, but in the broader field of international business law, the broader field of international economics and relations and policy making. So that's perhaps the purpose of having this distinguished panel of experts on broader issues and the implications of the book. And of course, thanking my colleagues in the faculty and CIBEL Center, Hannah there and Tams there, for helping organize this event. Now, I kind of assigned a very, very light role to myself today, which is talk about the history of the book and just leave the heavy lifting stuff to Henry. But I will say how my luck goes. Henry is in transit to.
Hi, everyone.
Fantastic, we can hear you. So I will make sure I finish very quickly. So you still have time to talk about the book. So my role is not to talk about the book. My role is to talk about the history of the book, not the content of it. Henry will do the heavy lifting of it. So Henry and I started to work together since around 2016, which is basically my second year as an academic after several years of practice as a trade and commercial lawyer in Sydney. And this is actually our first project, which we're trying to uncover China's new round of state-owned enterprise reforms, which commenced just a couple of years ago at the time of 2016. Now, at the time, the reform was at the very, very beginning, and we don't really have lots of materials, except that we did have lots of regulatory instruments coming out. So that has been kind of developing very, very quickly at the time. And as trade lawyers, after have dealt with the domestic reform process and regulatory and policy strategies, we started thinking about how this actually fit into the international trade regulation perspective. And in other words, dealing with the critique at the time, which has become an even bigger and controversial issue now, whether we have sufficient rules to deal with China's SOEs and state capitalism in general. So that was kind of the motivation at the time to deal with these things. And we presented the first paper. That paper was published by the International Comparative Law Quarterly. We published the first paper and presented it at, I think, the very last CIBEL conference in person in 2018. And after the conference, I was very well received, and a number of senior colleagues, including Professor Colin Picker here, encouraged us to kind of turn it into a book project. And then we submitted the book proposal to Cambridge University Press, and externally reviewed by 3 commentators, all came back to say, great project, we would love to see this book coming out, and the quicker the better, and recommended acceptance by Cambridge without hesitation. Now, the journey was obviously not easy, as everyone knows, because COVID basically hit us and stopped us from being productive. And we were dragged on for about 2.5 or 3 years before we can actually restart the project. So we were started the project and trying to finish the book as soon as we can, because in 2020 and 2021, the narrative about China being a state-led economy, not compatible with the liberal order runs by the WTO, and WTO does not provide sufficient rules to deal with China's state capitalism, have become the dominant, even more dominant narrative. So we thought that, okay, this is actually a better time to publish the book. But during the whole period, we tried to engage with the public debates in this field and in the broader field of international law. So we published several articles jointly and separately for that purpose. And some of the articles became part of the book. And at the end of the day, we wrote about 4 new chapters, and we wrote most of the existing chapters, especially substantive updates after years of development domestically and internationally. And then we came to the editing process, which was very, very time consuming. We were very fortunate, again, to be assisted, the kind of the third person I need to thank, which is Dr. Sophia Bai. Sophia, Sophia was the co-author in the first article, and Sophia now is a CIBEL postdoc, and she helped us with the editing process, especially with the style compliance. And also Carly Bonnet, who is now our final year PhD candidates. She read and proofread the whole book at the time, and without their assistance, the book wouldn't be able to see the light of the day so quickly. So my thanks to them. And finally, I also would like to thank 2 endorsers of the book, Professor Jennifer Hillman and Professor Petros Mavroidis, as the leading experts in this field. I mean, with their positive endorsements, I think Healey and I are very confident that this book has addressed a very significant issue, even more timely issue today, in terms of a fundamental challenge to the world trading system. Now, when I say the world trading system, it's not only the WTO, but the whole system that the trading nations deal with collectively and today, as we face lots of other challenges. And also being confident about the new materials will provide evidence, critical analysis of the dominant narrative, and kind of the strong incentive to provide some practical implications and practical solutions for how the system can be improved in the future. And I think with that, I will leave it to Healey to deal with the heavier part of it. Healey, over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate Weihuan and his colleagues at UNSW to organize this event. I hoped that I was able to join you in person in Sydney, but due to various engagements, I have to participate only online today. So I would echo the same thanks and appreciation so that Weihuan has shared, including the many people we have worked with, including the many people who have helped, and including, of course, Weihuan, my great co-author. So as Weihuan mentioned, we first started doing this project back in 2016. So when we look at the world back in 2016, it was a very different place. There was no trade war. There was no Ukraine war, and the US was still actively negotiating the TPP. And finally, most importantly, the WTO appellate body, my former employer, was still functioning. And actually, the only complaints I heard from my colleagues and the appellate body secretary was that they had too much work to do. I guess they are happier now that they have no work to do nowadays. Just kidding. Now, fast forward to the world today. What we have is a very different world. And many of the developments over the past few years have actually confirmed the kind of concerns that we address in the book. And I will summarize this as two problems and one promise. The first problem we identified in the book is China's increasing turn towards state capitalism and away from the market economy, as we captured in the title of the book. And we see this, you can refer to the relevant chapter in the book where we kind of documented the Chinese shift. But this is also confirmed by more recent events. For example, at the recent meeting of the National People's Congress in China just held last week, we saw that various new institutions were instituted, and this included the new social works department in order to build party organizations in private funds, something which actually we highlighted in our book. And we also addressed in that the very first product of a collaboration that we published in the International Comparative Law Quarterly. So that is something that has been increasingly confirmed by more and more recent events. And the second problem we identified in the book is the effects of China's turn towards state capitalism. And we argued in the book that the effect is not confined to within China, but will be felt beyond its shores. And this is confirmed actually, again, by several recent events, including the regulatory crackdowns, which happened in China over the past 2-3 years, which affected not only Chinese firms, but also foreign firms, and probably more so. A good example is the recent fine on US accounting firm Deloitte, which was actually fined more than 30 million US dollars for allegedly failing to perform its duty in assessing the quality of the assets of the China Huarong Asset Management Company. Now, this is a very ironical because the main culprit in the case, the Huarong company, actually was fined much less. And I guess this is a wake-up call for all foreign firms operating in China. And the promise which we identify in the book is the promise of a multilateralism. Now, when we first started working on the project, actually many people, including those in the trade law circles, were quite skeptical of the ability of WTO rules to deal with China, and they were even more skeptical of the ability of the WTO to make new rules to address China issues and other related issues. But again, I'm happy to report that there have been some very good news from Geneva recently. The first is the conclusion of the Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation in December 2021, which included both the US and China. And the second is the hopefully upcoming conclusion of the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, which, as I understand from my colleagues in Geneva, would probably happen by the time of the 13th Ministerial Conference next year. So that is, I guess, a bit of a silver lining to all these problems that I mentioned. So what does these latest developments tell us about the future? Again, these correspond to the themes that we explore in the book, and I will list the three main points. First, the world really need to understand China better. And we try to do that in our book with the earlier chapters where we discuss, China's SOU reform, the initial good moves towards more separation of the state and the government, and also towards less intervention by the government and the state in the operation of the firms. You can refer to that. But more recently, as we can see, because of the regulatory crackdowns, the tech crackdowns, so there has been quite some upheaval in China, and the urgency of the need to understand China better is felt even more. So actually, both Weihuan and I have been trying to do that. For example, recently, actually just 2 days ago, I published this op-ed with the Center for Innovation for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, the think tank that I'm also affiliated with, where I analyzed whether China's tech crackdown will continue. Second, the world really needs to react to China. And I would argue, as we discussed in the book, that this would include, for example, bringing more countervailing duty measures against the Chinese subsidies. I mean, a lot of people complain that the existing WTO was insufficient, but one key argument we made in the book was that actually there has been a lack of utility, lack of usage of existing rules. There are many existing rules available in both the general rule book of the WTO and also in the specific accession protocol and working party report on of China on tailor-made rules on China, which could be used to challenge China's subsidies measures. And we also see some attempts made by some WTO members recently. For example, the EU's new rules on certain country subsidies rules and also on the foreign subsidies rules. So these are all very promising. But in doing so, we would caution that we should avoid the tendency to out-China China by becoming more like China, as I warned actually in a recent episode of the Economist Mining Talks podcast. And again, that is something that we discussed in the book, because we do not really believe that to try to use subsidies, to try to use state support is the best way to go forward in developing the economy and developing your trade. And the third lesson we would draw for the future is that to fully achieve the potential of multilateralism, we would need to have all the countries concerned working together. And first and foremost, this would involve the United States. So we actually mentioned some of the efforts by the US to make new rules in various fora, such as in the free trade agreements like the CPTPP and also in the WTO. But we think that those efforts were insufficient and they need to be supplemented by other stronger efforts. But unfortunately, in recent years, we see that the US has been increasingly withdrawing from participation in the WTO. So as I mentioned recently in my interview, in the recent editorial of the New York Times, who benefits from confrontation with China, the US really need to shoulder rather than shirk its leadership responsibilities at the international level, participate more in various WTO initiatives, and try to come up with new rules. And second, and this is something that Weihuan, I, and also I think many colleagues in the trade law circle would share, is that we need to restore a fully functioning WTO dispute settlement system. Now, the US has said, US ambassador to the WTO, Maria Fagan, recently said that our goal is a fully functioning dispute settlement system by 2024. But she didn't make it clear whether this would include bringing back the appellate body. Now, the concern is that without the appellate body, it would be pretty useless to have new rules, because whatever rules you have would be fragmented and the parties can continue to appeal into the void. So that would not be the best result that we would like to see. So with all these words, I hope that I will successfully whetted your appetite for the book. And I would encourage you to please get hold of the book, either getting a copy or from the library. And I look forward to engaging with you in the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, very much for your exposition of the book, which I'm sure has whetted everyone's appetite for a copy. and you have exhibited great salesmanship in suggesting they all buy one, so or get it from the library, which is great. Look, I will just now call on Professor Vivienne Bath. Would you like to stay there, or are you going to come up here, Vivienne? Up to you.
I will speak into the mic in that case. I do not have PowerPoints, although I see that one of my co-presenters has let down the side by actually producing them. So like Weihuan, I'm going to stick to my piece of paper. Well, I have the advantage of being first in terms of the commentators, which means that I get to make all of the nice comments about the book. It is actually a very timely book, I think, in terms of its publication as world trade opens up and as Chinese companies begin to buy Australian coal again, and all sorts of other things of this kind. And so it has come out at the right time. And although it looks like quite a slim volume, it's actually action-packed. I think that one of its greatest contributions from the point of view of the reader whose eyes glaze over when they think about the WTO, which is quite a lot of us, is that it's eminently readable. It's very well organized, and the way in which Henry and Weihuan have set out the material is really clear. So, for example, it has a very nice summary of the 2014 reforms of state-owned enterprises and recent developments, which is much needed because it's really quite an incomprehensible collection of regulations, decrees, reforms, combinations, party influence, and all sorts of other things which have changed the structure of SOEs or changed the way in which they operate since the reforms came in. My PhD student Tianqi, who is there, has been battling away for months trying to sort out all of this material. So I think that to put it in the context of trade and the way in which SOEs operate in the world trade operation context and in the context of agreements is actually in itself a very useful contribution. People, I think, talk a lot about SOEs, but it's really quite hard to understand the various different types of SOEs that there are in China, the way in which they operate, and increasingly, of course, the way in which the Communist Party is integrated through more formalized structures because they've got themselves weaseled into the articles of association of listed companies and so on, but through indirect holding companies, through voting arrangements, even when you've got private enterprises holding shares in the operations and so on, which ensure that they are still essentially state-controlled entities. And this is quite an important thing for us to understand when we try to work out what we're actually talking about in the context of a state-owned enterprise. So I think that to begin with that and to make that clear has been very useful. I also like the way in which you went back to the original protocol and the accession documents of China, because I think it's a very good point that there's all sorts of material in there that China would probably prefer has actually been forgotten and has made suggestions on occasion have actually become redundant and past its time and should no longer be utilized. Because I think the major point in the book, which is that all of that material and all of those commitments are still there, is actually an important one. And I like the way in which you put all the material together and came up with a rather optimistic conclusion. Because I think myself that to try and get material out of China on subsidies is a very, very difficult task indeed. But I think that to find a way through and find an argument which perhaps will allow state-owned enterprises to be properly reviewed in the World Trade Organization is a very worthwhile activity. And to set it out as clearly as you have in the book is also, I think, a really great contribution to the literature in the area. So I was very interested to read that. I mean, there are also various other snippets in the book which caught my eye as I went through. I'm going to comment briefly on the CPTPP and FTA chapter, which I was particularly interested in because it deals with not just trade, but investment. But for example, in relation to evidence, I noticed the very good point which is made in talking about evidence in China, that one of the advantages of CCP integration into all of these enterprises is that now there is all this documentary evidence about the way in which these enterprises actually work. So when you're trying to trace through the ownership of the big SOEs, for example, it's all there. There are public announcements as to what they're doing. So if they're saying that they're actually purely commercial enterprises, there's going to be a picture of the chairman sort of handing out a large check for a welfare project. There's going to be some sort of commentary by the CCP chief talking about how they've made sure that certain policies are followed by SOEs. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence there, and it was very interesting to note the way in which you used this material to point that out, because I think a lot of people don't actually appreciate how much in China is documented. That's the great thing about being a several thousand-year-old bureaucracy. Somewhere it's all on paper. It's just a question of finding it. Now, I'm not going to talk for too long, because I know that the PowerPoints are waiting for you. But I did want to comment also on the chapter in relation to free trade agreements. Now, I think that it is a very interesting exercise to look at the way in which SOEs are dealt with in non-multilateral agreements, and certainly in relation to investment, it's certainly arguable that the SOE chapters are not very strong, but they're a relatively new development. And I think a lot of people expect that the CPTPP in particular has a strong, comprehensive, well-drafted, because it's so long, chapter on SOEs, and the same with these other agreements. But of course, it's quite true, as you point out, that not only is the scope of these provisions very narrow, because it relates to activities of state-owned enterprises and designated monopolies that affect trade or investment between parties within the free trade area, it also doesn't pick up a whole lot of very important points. So if it's focused on China, it's very clear in the way these are drafted that there were certainly quite a few people in the drafting process who were trying very hard to ensure that their own state-owned enterprises were not actually going to be picked up by the provisions of this chapter. And so the language doesn't, as you point out, pick up Chinese SOEs. It doesn't pick up all the sorts of mechanisms of control that the Communist Party exercises in SOEs through formal and informal mechanisms. It has this extremely wide exemption for smaller SOEs, which of course encompass tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of entities in China, and probably, I suspect, in the rest of the CPTPP area. So it is actually very interesting to see this laid out, and it illustrates, I think, the general point, which, and going back to what I was saying about explaining how Chinese SOEs work, which is that most people actually don't understand it. And in fact, if they think of Chinese SOEs, they are really looking at the listed companies, which are a small part of the group of the big SOEs, which have hundreds, thousands of subsidiaries, most of which aren't listed, don't issue reports, and if you look at their websites, provide virtually no information at all. I mean, if you look at it, certainly in the investment context, there's a lot to be said for the Australian screening approach, which gets so much criticism, which is that everyone who's government owned, or more than 20% government owned, has to be screened before they're actually allowed in. Because in terms of enforcing it through these various bilateral and multilateral agreements, certainly seems to be extremely difficult. I mean, as Henry said, I think it's a difficult task to actually deal with the SOEs in the Chinese context. Certainly, I think understanding how they work and how the structures operate and are manipulated is an important first step. And I think that with your ambitious proposal of going back to the accession and the protocol, you do outline what one hopes will be a potential way forward if we can ever fix up what happens with the appellate body. So I will stop there. But congratulations. I think it's really a very interesting book.
Thank you, Vivienne. So our next speaker is Mr. James Baxter. James, are you coming up here or sitting there?
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to participate this afternoon. I really welcome the opportunity to be part of the launch of the book, and I do want to commend the authors, Healey and Weihuan Zhou, who've made a welcome effort to contribute to ideas that address some of the really important tensions facing the global trading system, and importantly, some ideas about how those tensions might be resolved. As we've heard, one of the key points the authors make is that the World Trade Organization, and I just want to alert you all here, I'm going to be talking a lot about the World Trade Organization, so if you see Professor Bart's eyes glazing over, you can attribute that to me. But one of their arguments is that the World Trade Organization does provide an avenue for resolving those tensions, firstly through the application of its existing rules, and secondly through the negotiation of new rules that would update the WTO agreement. Now, that's the sort of approach that the Australian government, as a matter of principle, seeks to follow when considering how to promote and enhance international trading relations. And that reflects the importance of the WTO to Australia. As the Minister for Trade and Tourism has made clear, WTO rules have underpinned decades of Australia's openness to trade and investment. And that trade and investment has in turn materially increased Australian living standards. Those WTO rules, of course, themselves form a vital part of a broader global framework of international rules and norms. And those international rules and norms underpin sovereignty, security, and prosperity for Australia, and also for others. So Australia has invested heavily in the WTO and continues to do so. And that's because we can't, in the words of the Minister for Trade and Tourism, risk a return to the law of the jungle, should the WTO be allowed to wither. What Australia wants to see is a strong and effective WTO. That means a WTO that incorporates disciplines that address the main challenges facing global trade and investment flows, and one where those disciplines can be made effective through cooperation or through compliance mechanisms. While the WTO still plays a vital role in global trade in 2023, the world is some way from having a WTO that's delivering everything Australia would want to see. As anyone who observes the WTO would recognise, the organisation faces challenges on more than one front. First of all, as Professor Gao mentioned, the dispute settlement system is not working as effectively as it should be. For more than 2 decades, that system was a mechanism that provided members with a genuine capacity to enforce rules, including against much larger economies. The current paralysis in the appellate body has narrowed that capacity considerably. And the authors do a very good job of outlining the ramifications of that situation for tackling some of the problems that might arise from the use of subsidies or the behaviour of state-owned enterprises. Now, the Australian government's working actively to restore the WTO's settlement system to full functionality. Firstly, through encouraging a discussion among all WTO members about what reforms might be needed to get the system up and running multilaterally again. And secondly, through participating in the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement, or MPIA, one of the worst names, even by trade agreement standards, that I've come across. An agreement that provides an alternative among the 26 participants that allows the enforcement of dispute settlement mechanisms. And Australia welcomes Japan's announcement just 10 days ago that it would join the MPIA. And I should note here, as most in this room will be aware, that Australia is actively using the WTO's dispute settlement system as a vehicle for addressing China's duties against Australian exports of barley and wine, which demonstrates the very practical value that system still delivers for us. A second major challenge facing the WTO, of course, has been the difficulty of updating its rulebook. Since its establishment in 1995, WTO members have concluded just 2 major new multilateral agreements. The Trade Facilitation Agreement in 2013, and last year a new agreement on fisheries subsidies. WTO membership has also agreed on new rules in areas important to Australia, such as the elimination of export subsidies on agricultural products. But broader evolution in WTO disciplines that apply multilaterally is good elusive. The Doha round, launched in 2001, did not deliver except in a few limited areas I've already referred to. And the WTO has as yet been unable to develop new rules that would govern some of the key issues affecting international trade in the 21st century. Digital trade is one notable area, and another relates to competition between private firms and public enterprises whose activities may affect international trade and commerce. And the authors address some of the issues that have been most prominently identified by WTO members, notably the activities of SOEs and the use of subsidies, particularly subsidies on industrial products. And as will be clear to anyone who reads the book, gaps in WTO rules in some of these areas, on some of these issues, do not reflect a lack of interest on the part of governments. Australia and others in the region have actively been developing on digital trade and also on SOEs in the context of the agreements we've already been talking about, including the CPTPP. And while the CPTPP may be the best known example of an agreement that incorporates disciplines on a much wider range of issues than is covered by the WTO agreements, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, also contains some rules in some of these areas. Now, Australia's been an active supporter of the development of bilateral and regional free trade agreements. And one of the points successive governments have made is that such agreements can complement the 7 disciplines that's laid down in the WTO. But we would like to see addressed some of the gaps in the coverage of WTO rules, because those gaps are arguably sapping the vigour of the organisation and the buy-in of some members to it. Against that background, Australia has welcomed suggestions that WTO members discuss the basket of market economy issues that have arisen as a point of tension among major members, including between the US, the EU and China. And our support for those suggestions reflects a recognition of their significance to those players and to the WTO membership more broadly. The authors do a very good job of reminding us that issues relating to China's economic governance structures are not new, and that they were rather a very prominent area of interest of WTO members through China's accession negotiations in the 1990s. They note that the focus of members during the accession period was principally on specific aspects of the Chinese system and how members sought to address those specific forms of behaviour at the time. Now, as we've heard, the specific rules negotiated as part of China's accession may provide a basis for resolving concerns about the potential impact of China's SOEs and subsidies on trade and investment interests of other members. From Australia's viewpoint, that account underlines the importance of according proper recognition to the value of WTO rules. While we can all acknowledge the challenges facing the WTO, the reach of its values, the reach and value of its rules, even in 2023, should not be underestimated either. As the authors note, while WTO rules on SOEs may in general terms be fairly narrowly cast, the rules that apply to China may discipline forms of behaviour that go beyond those general rules. At the same time, we endorse the acknowledgement by the authors that there's room for WTO members to build on the existing rules. And we welcome their encouragement to negotiate these rules multilaterally in a way that constructively engages China. In this context, the authors note that China's interest in joining the CPTPP, which includes rules on SOEs, suggests a willingness on the part of China to take on obligations relating to SOEs. Importantly, they point out as well that China is not the only WTO member whose economy features SOEs as prominent actors. Another factor that highlights the value of investing in developing multilateral discussions on new rules. Notwithstanding that some FTAs feature rules on SOEs, the WTO provides the only existing forum for all major members to come together to consider what additional rules might be needed. Of course, experience shows that negotiating new rules in the WTO is neither easy nor quick. Success will require commitment, investment, and compromises on the part of key members. And speaking frankly, it's not clear whether those factors are actually in place yet. In the meantime, there are some things that some of those key WTO members can do to reduce the risks associated with tensions arising from differences over questions of state capitalism. We've been encouraged by recent moves by the United States to move forward in discussions in Geneva on reforming the WTO dispute settlement system. At the WTO's last ministerial conference in 2022, members agreed to have an effective and accessible system restored by 2024. And that has been recently endorsed again by the United States, as Pascal pointed out. The US has, for its part, over the last year, been leading informal exchanges among members in Geneva about the reforms that might be needed, and will continue to highlight to the United States the importance of an early conclusion to this work for Australia and for other members. For its part, we would also like to see China take a leadership role by doing what it can to reduce trade-related tensions that have arisen among it and other major WTO members in recent years. As the authors note, China's record in compliance with its notification obligations under the WTO agreement could be better. The size of the Chinese economy and its position as the world's largest trading economy and trading goods means that Chinese measures have an undeniable potential to affect the interests of all other members. In view of that consideration, Australia would encourage China to become an exemplar in provision of notifications required under WTO rules. In parallel, we would also encourage China to consider how it might increase confidence on the part of its trade and economic partners through enhancing transparency domestically. Now, this is not an area the authors explore in detail in this work, but the issue is one that's important to a number of WTO members, as became clear in the WTO's trade policy review of China in 2021. Allow me to conclude by highlighting the importance Australia attaches to its bilateral economic relationship with China. Two-way trade has benefited both countries, with China Australia's top bilateral trading partner for more than 15 years now. The removal of the current impediments to Australian exports and the full resumption of our bilateral trade would greatly benefit both Australia and China. China's investment in Australia, including investment by SOEs, has contributed to economic growth and job creation in Australia. And as an open trading nation, Australia's welcome foreign investment, including from China, while applying a national interest test. A strong platform of agreed rules governing trade and investment has underpinned the growth of our economic relationship with China, as it has for China's economic relations with other WTO members. We want to work with China and with other members to revitalise the existing rules and to update them, so that governments across the world can have confidence that economic relationships are and will remain mutually beneficial. The authors have pointed to some of the avenues that governments might explore when it comes to accommodating different economic structures in the WTO. And in doing so, they've contributed to a discussion that's of growing significance. So thank you to them, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, friends. So our next presenter is James Laurenceson. You're coming up too, James?
All right, I think we're ready to go. Okay, thank you for the invitation, and my apologies to my fellow panelists for using PowerPoint. It's not because my presentation is any better, it's just because I've got an awful memory, and so it helps me to keep my talk on track. Look, the first thing I just want to cover, conflict of interest. Weihuan Zhou is my co-author on some academic publications and some commentary pieces. And so if you want to apply a discount factor to any sweet words I say about the book, because of that past track record of collaboration, please do so. Look, let me start off with the punchline of my appreciation for this book. For me, by emphasizing the utility of the World Trade Organization, Henry and Weihuan are doing an enormous service to public policy, because what they're doing is they're bolstering the intellectual case for the Australian government's traditional approach to trade policy. The Australian government's approach, as James said, has very much been focused on open regionalism, free trade, underpinned by a multilateral rules-based trading system at which the World Trade Organization is at the heart of. And this book really doubles down on that approach by arguing that China's rise is not inconsistent. In fact, the existing rules can actually be usefully applied to manage the challenges that China presents. And look, I say this is important, not because the Australian government has shifted in its approach. It remains committed to that traditional approach, but there is a big advocacy push underway to move away from that system. And just as an economist, not as a lawyer, I'll leave that to Weihuan and Henry, but just as an economist, it's quite a frightening shift that some people are pushing in. It is very popular these days to talk about a trade policy driven by a concept called trusted trade. A form of trusted trade you may be more familiar with is something called friend-shored supply chains. The basic idea is that policymakers should preference geopolitical friends, right? Or preference against geopolitical foes. And guess who? Many would regard as one of Australia's geopolitical foes. That would be Beijing and China. And so we would see a move away from a multilateral system underpinned by the World Trade Organization towards one more characterized by completing blocks where you have geopolitically aligned countries trading more with each other and less with everyone else. Now, I get on a superficial level how that might bring comfort to some people, right? We've seen over the last 3 years, China launch an unprecedented campaign of economic coercion against Australia. right? So geopolitics has spilled over to hurt trade. That has brought costs to Australian producers. So I get the superficial attraction. Well, why don't we just trade more with our geopolitical mates? Well, I think that's drawing the wrong policy lesson from the one that we should be drawing. Along with this trusted trade push is there's a strand of this commentary that's very consistent that we should be transforming our security alignments and attaching onto them an economic element. So we should be transforming the ANZUS alliance to embrace an economics alliance, the Quad partnership, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. And what about the Five Eyes as well? This is all part of the current push that's underway. Again, I don't want to overstate this because this is not Australian government policy right now, but this is a clear push that is underway. And we shouldn't assume that the Australian government will be immune to this push. Now, the fortunate thing so far is that even the former government, which I don't think any of us will disagree, had major problems in the geopolitical space with Beijing. If you read Scott Morrison's statements, he remained of the view that the spillover of geopolitics to hurt economics and trade interests, they were risks that only businesses could handle, and the businesses would have to perform their own risk assessments and mitigate those risks in their own way. Now, I think this is an extremely sensible approach. Because the truth is that while sometimes some security commentators paint Australian businesses as being naive or just plain stupid about China, in fact, my experience from talking to businesses is that they are very much alive to geopolitical risk. And why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? It's their money that's on the line. When Beijing put a massive tariff on Australian barley producers, it wasn't Canberra that got hit or Australian taxpayers as a whole, it was barley growers. And that's true across the board. So Australian businesses have the incentive and the information to assess risk accurately and to choose amongst the suite of mitigation options that they have. The second consideration I think we really do need to keep in mind, aside from the mitigations that Henry and Weihuan's book outlines in the legal space, is that there are economic sources of mitigation too. For example, China's own self-interest meant that most of the big ticket trade items between Australia and China were left untouched. Why is that? Well, that's because Beijing needs our iron ore. It needs our wool. It needs our LNG. It needs our lithium. So this idea that Beijing is just trigger happy and will willy-nilly take a geopolitical dispute and weaponize trade is just simply incorrect because of Beijing's own self-interest. The second reason why it's incorrect is because Australian businesses have access to multiple sources of mitigation. And the most important source of mitigation is, guess what? Not our geopolitical friends, but the multilateral trading system underpinned by the World Trade Organization that Henry and Weihuan's book suggests we double down on. 3/4 of Australian cotton exports went to China in 2020. Overnight, Beijing closed the door. The response of Australian cotton producers? Basically shrugged their shoulders. Why? Because that good is traded into open and competitive global markets, backstopped by the WTO, and almost overnight, global markets redirected at low cost those exports, basically zero costs incurred by domestic cotton exporters. The second thing businesses will tell you is, hang on, yes, the United States and Japan and India, they're all great geopolitical mates. We don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that. I'm not anti-US alliance, but let's be clear, in the commercial realm, more often than not, those countries are Australia's competitors. They are our fiercest competitors. In fact, I've run the numbers on this, and the country that snapped up most lost Australian sales to China was, guess who? The United States, right? That's just an empirical fact. I'm not accusing Washington of being duplicitous in its support for Australia. I'm just saying that is the real world of commercial engagement. And I think there are real concerns about where some of our geopolitical mates are heading. In the United States, and the book actually touches on this, the US is taking an approach to national security that is really quite extraordinary. Let me give you one example. In 2020, the Trump administration insisted that all exports from Hong Kong to the United States had to be labeled made in China, right? Hong Kong protested. The World Trade Organization agreed with Hong Kong, and the US response was, quote, "We have no intention of abiding by the WTO's decision." That's because we consider this a threat to our national security. Get that, folks. They considered a label that said made in China rather than made in Hong Kong as a threat to their national security. Well, can I just say that's not a world Australia wants to move into? Because if Beijing starts making similar calls, then the global trading system that Australia relies on to protect its interest is going to go down the gurgler very, very quickly. I also think we should apply some healthy skepticism to the ability of bureaucrats. James, I'm sure you're a fantastic bureaucrat. I'm sure you're fantastic. But the idea that bureaucrats and government can stitch together supply chains is just ridiculous. Right? They don't have the information, they don't have the resources to do so. Let's take a look at some of the recent examples. This one was announced with much fanfare in April 2021, a quad vaccine initiative. Great, right? We're going to use US technology, Japanese funding, and Indian manufacturing to supply vaccines to the Indo-Pacific region. Well, who could be against that? Not me. First problem, honestly, Australia didn't really have a role to play. If you read the press release, we were relegated to supplying 77 million for last mile delivery services. In other words, it was a stitched together supply chain that Australia really didn't have anything to contribute to. And by the way, what did it produce? It's produced absolutely nothing. Right? And I won't go into the details of why it hasn't, but that's all now on the public record. So I think we should be very skeptical of the ability of friend-shored supply chains to improve upon a system of open and competitive global markets underpinned by the World Trade Organization. Now, as I said, the good news is the Australian government, supported by James, is not heading down this route yet. In fact, if you read Penny Wong's latest speeches, I've been thoroughly impressed. She remains committed to Australia being economically integrated in East Asia. She says that's good for our prosperity and our security, ditto for the region. I think she's right. Thank you, Weihuan. Thank you, Henry, for, I think, bolstering the intellectual case for that position. But we should not assume that position cannot be changed in the future. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, James. Now, and I thank all of our speakers and will again at the conclusion of this session. But are there any questions from the floor at this point? Brett?
Yeah, Brett, there is a mic there.
Last time I came here for a book launch with Weihuan, it was because you were promoting a book combating the Washington groupthink about anti-dumping and about how the rules were designed only for market economies. And the great thing about that is you wrote a book that was trying to make the multilateral rules work better. And now here we are again with another book which is aimed at combating another aspect of Washington groupthink about how the rules can't cope with non-market economies. And you're trying to approach it by trying to say how we can think this through to make the multilateral rules work better. So I think that's a marvelous contribution. And it's a contribution that's, it's not about what you're contributing in Kensington, New South Wales today. This is something for people in Washington to think about. And I think it's a great tribute to you and Henry that you're able to get Petros Mavroidis and Jennifer Hillman to endorse your book, to introduce it into thinking in other places. I also am very grateful for all the comments from the commentators. I just want to say one thing to James, and that is that it's great that you're still pushing at the multilateral system. It's great that you're still pushing at transparency. It's great that you want China to make more transparent disclosures. But I think Australia can do more to enhance transparency. I think there's still too much behind the scenes resolution of disputes. And I think that you would actually help the world trading system if, for example, you make public press releases about the questions that you ask China to justify their SPS restrictions on lobster. You make public press releases of the documents that you table at the TBT committee asking China to justify its restrictions on supposed beetles appearing in timber from Victoria. And this book is also encouraging more litigation. I still think, and you've heard my view on this before, I don't understand why the Australian government did not litigate more of these cases with China, particularly the coal dispute. The WTO multilateral system is really going to be damaged if countries are able to introduce measures where there's no law, there's no regulation, there's no public statement, there's no public announcement, there's nothing. And so the government has this plausible deniability where they say, who, us? We didn't impose a restriction, until afterwards the Chinese government starts saying, yes, we've withdrawn that restriction that we never imposed. I think you should have challenged that, and I think there's more. Maybe you agree with me. You can please yourself whether you respond to the suggestion here or not, but I think there's more you can do for transparency that would be helpful to the system.
Well, thank you, Brett. Would you like to respond to that, James?
Deb, can I just say something? Thanks, Brett. Thanks for my commentators and all of your very, very constructive comments, which I actually took note of it, and I may, if I have time, we can exchange more ideas. But I just want to comment on Brett's views, and especially one of the views that links to my views on multilateralism and how you should go, and Australia's position on it. And this actually relates to the co-authored piece between James and myself last year, encouraging Australia to think seriously about opening the door for negotiation, not opening the door for China to accede to CPTPP, but to open the door for negotiation. But I think the first point, Brett, I want to make is that thanks for your first comment. And Henry actually will be at Georgetown Law next week, which is the kind of the second book event invited by Jennifer Hillman. And can we borrow your statements and endorsements, and I'll just pass it on to Henry. Henry is still there. I hope you have. Yes. I hope you have made a record of that statement by Brett, so you can bring it on next week.
We should possibly ask Henry what time his plane goes.
Yes, I was supposed to wake up at 6 a.m. for the next week's events. But anyway, so the second point I think about CPTPP, especially about transparency and notification requirements and obligations that James mentioned, about China, how China can take a leadership. I think CPTPP provides the most hope, to be honest, if we can make sure the enforcement mechanism works, and we can use the negotiation to basically compel China in a way to do some pre-accession notification and transparency obligation. For example, notify or make subsidy rules or subsidies more transparent on their online platforms, provide more information about state-owned enterprises. So all of these things that can be made during the negotiation, maybe ask China to take a little bit kind of a full range of transparency obligations, not kind of taking the exceptions or giving exceptions to China, as many other countries have been given during the CPTPP negotiations, but we can use that process to get China to be more transparent. I think that was one of the concerns about China's SOEs and subsidies, as also Brett mentioned. I do want to also say something about Vivienne's main point about how difficult it is to really understand Chinese SOEs. I think what's happening in the world at the moment is that, especially in Europe, they have started using the evidence that we provide in the book and also in the public domain about the role of the party in Chinese state entities and private entities, even private entities in their trade remedy investigations, and basically say that you have a party cell there, which plays a control role, or at least are very influential to the decision making of the entity, and therefore that provides evidence to us in our treat remedy investigations to find positive and against you. So I think that evidence that the SOE reform that China is currently trying to implementing in the domestic forum has provided more evidence and information for foreign governments to think about how they negotiate with China, how they take multilateral approaches, how they take bilateral approaches, and also, frankly, unilateral approaches, which I do not support, but that's what's happening in the real world.
Does Henry want to
Henry, do you want to say anything?
before we call on the panel members to?
Yes, thank you, Deborah, and thanks to Vivienne and to James for kindly providing your comments. Really insightful. I learned a lot, and I think the most valuable thing that I learned from the panel discussion today is the unique Australian perspective. Many of the issues that we discussed. Of course, we have some of the challenges as identified by James Laurenceson. Some of these, for example, friendshoring initiatives, which I actually called in a recent working paper, the shift from a global value chain to global values chain, a supply chain that is based on values rather than the value. I think that is really worrisome, and I hope that we can try to shift that. But on the other hand, we also see from the discussions many of the promises that actually Australia helped to fulfill in the WTO. For example, Australia, together with Singapore, serves as two of the three co-conveners in the GSR e-commerce, and given China's increasingly tight policies on data in recent years, I think that is definitely something that we can, try to find some new rules. And also, I echo Weihuan's comment on the need to bring China into the CPTPP. Actually, 2 years ago, Weihuan and we co-authored another piece for Nikkei Asia, in which we discussed how China's accession to the CPTPP is actually closer than most people would think. And we still hold that view today. And we think that actually the potential of the CPTPP lies in the fact that it can create new rules that to contain China's behavior. Because nowadays the WTO is not really working, so the CPTPP could provide another very important check against China. And on that front, actually, a very good news recently, of just last week, I think, is that the CPTPP actually just establishes the very first dispute settlement panel, with Professor Jennifer Hillman being the chair of the panel. So that also illustrated the promise of the CPTPP as another trade forum. So the advice from Weihuan and me is basically to get China in and to try to revise some of the rules if you think that would help. And it is better to involve China, to engage China rather than to leave China out. So I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry. Would any of the panelists like to comment on Brett Williamson's comments? If not, I will ask for further questions. Professor Ros Dixon, next.
I just want to congratulate you, Henry and Weihuan, for a great book and discussion. It's wonderful to have such an interdisciplinary panel, and it's a testament to CIBEL and the organisers, but to your book. So congratulations. Like Professor Barth, I think there's an optimism to this book. I mean, I believe in the goal, but I think it's an optimistic account of how China is likely to respond. And I wondered whether you had given any thought to the likelihood that most of the SOEs that you chart could compete without the state subsidies, so that the likelihood that China would engage constructively in a WTO, CHAFTA, or any other multilateral, rules-based system in response to challenges would seem to me to depend heavily on whether these SOEs can survive absent the subsidy. In some ways, that means that the broad parameters of ownership in China can continue even if those entities are less competitive. I mean, Deb Healey's work obviously is about competitive neutrality and when that threshold is reached. But I think given that there are so many of them, as Professor Barth says, we know so little about them, I think a pretty important question for your future discussion and thinking, and I'd be interested if you had any initial reaction, is can they compete without the subsidy? Because if not, I think your account is too optimistic. But if there's a way forward for them to be less profitable but still competitive, then I think your account is very plausible.
Thanks, Ross. Henry, do you have anything to say? Because it's a difficult question, so I let you to deal with it first.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, that is a very good question. And I think to answer that question, we need empirical evidence. And actually, I have been doing some work with some economist friends in that regard by looking at basically the effect of subsidies in a few jurisdictions, including China. And I think the answer is it would really depend on the sector. So in some sectors, without subsidy, I think it is hard to see that the SOEs would be able to survive. But in some other sectors, especially where the SOEs have the technological advantage, then we think that the SOEs are probably quite competitive in the market, even without the subsidies. So it really depends on the empirical evidence. But I think the general point we make in the book still stands in that, subsidies issue not just for SOEs in China, but also increasingly because of the merge of the state and the government, and also of the state and the enterprises, including both the SOE and the private firms, especially with the recent drive to establish party cells in the private enterprises and have the private enterprises basically listen to the party on key decisions. We think that is something that we should definitely try to prevent, because economists have debated as to what are the effects of the subsidies, right? Some economists have argued, for example, that some subsidies could be good, such as the R&D subsidies or some of the developmental subsidies, in order to pull them out of the value chain and so on. But regardless of this debate, one thing is for sure that whatever decisions by the firms should be made by the firms themselves rather than by another entity, and in the case of China, the party. So that is another point that we try to make in the book, because if you look at the discussion where we discuss China's accession protocol, where we discuss that actually a major part of the discussion in the accession negotiation was, whether the party would interfere in the decisions of the enterprises, including both the SOEs and private firms. And the answer is to be no. So that is something that we also emphasize, and I think that is another key that we have to focus on in addition to the effect of subsidies. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Thanks, Henry, for giving me the headspace. Let me just quickly, Ross, just three very quick response. I think the first point is to say the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism has been very effective on China. I had a book in 2019 reviewing all of the China-related case, the case that China lost in the WTO and the implementation. And China has implemented 99% of the cases. Now, you can make an argument about how systemic this implementation was, but I think this shows that China was genuinely interested in implementing and enforcing WTO rulings. Now, if we had a panel body today, China would remain, in my view, amendable to WTO rulings and enforcement. But we don't have the panel body. So, and we don't have a functional system. So I think that's the first point I want to make, and how we can use the system, as Henry said, and the rules to enforce China's obligations. The second point I want to say is subsidies is a global problem. And there was a study 2 years ago, basically comparing the corporate subsidies in the US, EU, and China. The US and EU have comparable size of subsidies. Now, Henry and my suggestion is not to say that we can find the WTO can be eliminating all subsidies that China is imposing. It's not realistic. But what we're saying is that we can at least use the rules to do it step by step and trying to target the most, the subsidies that have the most spillover effects on trading partners. Because you don't really challenge every subsidy. And that's and countries, because of the glass house effect, the countries exercise self-restraint on which subsidies do we challenge. Now, if you consider the export restrictions or the export subsidies, China have been imposing for many years in the past, the WTO was very effective in dealing with these kinds of direct or indirect subsidies. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of the impact on SOEs, you just have to, again, it needs to be, as I agree with you, there needs to be more studies about how that could actually impact on the competitiveness of SOEs. And that needs to be discussed based on the understanding that we won't be able to actually eliminate all subsidies. And there will be some subsidies in different sectors. And will be subsidies in sectors that involve mostly SOEs, but also will be subsidies in sectors involving many private-owned enterprises. And how that kind of going to change the competitive condition or dynamic between these kind of entities. I don't really have an answer to that question. But if both state-owned enterprises and private-owned enterprises receive subsidies to some extent in different kinds, then would it be less competitive in terms of the economy and in terms of the international economic system if we only remove subsidies for SOEs? So that's something I think we need to be very objective.
Can I just add something on that? It's really interesting that, I do work on competitive neutrality, and that looks at subsidies, and the OECD put a recommendation out last year, and it applies to SOEs and to private companies. It doesn't just, it would traditionally Australia's rules on that have applied just to SOEs, but in the OECD says it applies to everyone. Okay, there's a couple more questions, and the questions can be to the speakers, of course, as well as to the authors. So we'll go to those two.
Thank you, Lisa Tui, University of Newcastle. I really like and I haven't read your book yet. I've been carrying it around for the afternoon, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But I note that like a lot of the discussion is sort of about the systemic benefits, the benefits to the system of addressing SOEs or addressing subsidies. And I'm wondering if you might make a few comments on the Australian perspective. So where does Australia stand to benefit, in your opinions, from addressing some of these issues? So for example, is it really going to be a good use of Australia's resources to address WTO accession issues with China, or are our efforts better directed towards dealing with the underlying issues of subsidies and so on? I guess another way of maybe me putting the question is, in the counterfactual where there were no SOEs, how would Australia's position be significantly better? Is it our fight, or is it actually a fight for the United States, Europe, and selected others?
James, I think that's Henry, do you mind I go first? The first point is a practical point. I think I have been a trade remedy lawyer in Australia for many years, and I was involved in many anti-dumping and countervailing investigations against Chinese companies for about a decade. And I was also involved in some of the trade remedies, most recent trade remedies brought by China against Australia, including the one case. My reflection on my own experience is that I think the reason why Australia imposed a range of trade remedy actions against Chinese companies, I mean, subsidy being part of it, most of the time, the subsidy margin was significantly lower than the anti-dumping margin. So in other words, they found that the subsidies, there were subsidies provided by Chinese government to the companies, but the margin was very low to negligible, right? So from that perspective, that's kind of an empirical perspective. I think there was no need for Australia to kind of, from the Chinese perspective, or if only China was in the picture, then there was no kind of significant need for Australia to make an effort to deal with that. But subsidy is a global issue. And I never thought that Australia should only focus on China when it comes to subsidies. I think it needs to be taking a global view about how the system should be constructed or reconstructed to provide a more effective discipline against the subsidies as a whole. Because if you take the US subsidies, EU subsidies and India subsidies, all of the big subsidizing countries, and then you would have been thinking, what's the impact on Australia exports in the global market? Because essentially that reduces the competitiveness of Australian exporters. So from that perspective, I think there is a huge need for Australia to actively engage in the discussion of a subsidy disciplines and notification requirements and transparency. And let me end by saying that I think James said that Australia was in agreement with the joint statement made by US, EU, and Japan on how to reform the subsidy rules and SOE rules at the WTO. My view is that I think these the proposals in the joint statements were a little bit kind of too targeting on China. I think there needs to be a broader kind of deliberation about what subsidies are actually harmful at a global scale, and seek agreements by all members to deal with the most harmful subsidies, and also at the same time providing policy space for everyone to use some kind of legitimate subsidies.
Thanks.
James, do you want? I think James must.
Maybe I say something.
Thank you.
Is that working? Is that on?
Yeah, sounds like it.
Okay. Look, when Australia is considering taking dispute settlement action in the WTO, there will, well, in every case to date, there's been a strong commercial imperative. There may be other factors as well, but there's been a strong commercial imperative. Now, typically, if you look at Australia's export profile, the sort of subsidies that we're talking about here are mainly industrial subsidies, and typically they don't tend to affect significant levels of Australian exports. And if you look at the last offensive dispute we took on subsidies, it was against India on its sugar subsidies, and that's because its sugar subsidies were affecting the competitive position of Australian agricultural exporters in global markets. Now, that said, and actually, I think we've heard from virtually everyone this afternoon and elsewhere that the sort of policies that come up here do have a global impact. And that affects us in two ways. One, it can, and there are cases where government support has led to such a concentration in production that there's arguably a global vulnerability in relation to a particular product or commodity. That's something that should exercise in Australia, even if we don't compete with that. We don't compete with the producer of that product. But the other point I would make is that because we are so reliant on the system, we do look at anything that's creating real tensions for it. And this is not something we've never, in my view, taken the dispute solely because of systemic concerns, but I think it is something that we are increasingly aware of as there are greater strains on the WTO system, and the fact that you have the US and EU and Japan and China, at least, on different sides perhaps of a discussion about the way that rules on subsidies and SOEs and forced tech transfer operate, that alone is enough for us to be actively involved and supportive of an effort at the multilateral level to do something about it. Now, whether that's in the context of a dispute or the context of the WTO's deliberative function or a rulemaking effort, that's another question.
Okay. Well, look, I just wanted to, as we finalise the proceedings, I mean, you're all invited to have a drink and something to eat after this, and we can continue these discussions. But I'd just like to thank Professor Vivienne Barth, Mr. James Baxter, and Professor James Laurenceson for their discussion of the book in the context of legal perspectives, of policy perspectives, and of business and commercial perspectives, which I think gives a grand purview to the whole thing. I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's great to see CIBEL, myself and CIBEL are extremely proud of Weihuan and the book, and thank Henry for his terrific authorship as well. And he's been working with CIBEL for quite a long time. We're very proud to have that under the CIBEL badge. And we'd like to congratulate the authors on that basis. So a round of applause for the authors and the speakers, please. Thank you all for coming.